You find yourself standing on a scaffold in Smithfield, London, August 23rd, 1305. The air hangs thick with the stench of sweat mud and something metallic fear. Before you, a man named William Wallace is being systematically dismantled, piece by agonizing piece, in front of a mesmerized crowd. This isn't just an execution, it's a political broadcast, a meticulously engineered spectacle of terror performed in 4 acts. To the Scots, Wallace was a hero, the guardian of their kingdom. To the English, he was a savage terrorist, but to King Edward Darwin, he was a problem that required a very permanent and very public solution. The sentence was designed not merely to kill him, but to erase him, to transform the symbol of Scottish resistance into a grotesque warning of pathetic failure. So how did this masterclass in state-sanctioned horror go so catastrophically wrong? How did an execution designed to break a nation's spirit end up forging its soul? How did a dismembered corpse scattered across the kingdom as a warning become the most potent recruiting poster in Scottish history? It turns out, the curse wasn't some ancient prophecy whispered on the Highland winds. It was a fatal miscalculation by a king who understood the mechanics of brutality, but fatally misunderstood the physics of martyrdom. Before we begin the autopsy, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching this story unfold? Welcome to the chamber, where we discover how England's perfect punishment created its immortal enemy. To understand how the execution of one man became a masterpiece of state terror, we must first examine the machinery that built the stage. The horror that unfolded at Smithfield Market in 1305 was not born overnight in a fit of royal rage. It was the final logical output of a meticulously engineered system of control, one that escalated so methodically, its true purpose was only visible at its bloody conclusion. This is the forensic history of that system, a deep dive into how procedure law and administration were systematically weaponized piece by piece, until they created a legal framework for an atrocity. Before Edward Defiant, the political landscape between England and Scotland was a tangled but understood web of personal loyalties. The system that governed it was feudalism, a grand, often brutal, but internally consistent game of contracts. At its heart was the ceremony of homage, a deeply personal and ritualistic act. Imagine a Scottish earl, a man of immense power in his own land, kneeling before the English king. He would place his hands between the king's and swear an oath of fealty, becoming his man. This was often sealed with a kiss, a symbolic gesture binding 2 individuals in a network of mutual obligation. The lord offered protection and land, the vassal offered counsel and military service. This world was not one of clean modern borders and national identities. It was a messy patchwork of personal allegiances. The most powerful families, like the Bruces and the Balliols, were transnational players. They were Scottish nobles who also held vast estates in England and would therefore perform homage to the English king for those specific lands. Their loyalty was a complex calculation, a portfolio of allegiances that had to be carefully managed. A dispute between kings was for these men a dangerous conflict of interest, but it operated within a known set of rules. The cost of this system was primarily measured in pride and political capital. Kneeling was a public admission of subordinate status. An oath might force a noble to fight for a king he personally disliked. But the penalties for breaking these oaths were usually political or financial: the forfeiture of a title, the loss of an estate. The game was high stakes, but its violence was typically contained within the aristocratic class on the battlefield. No one was systematically disassembled for public consumption. This was the baseline, the normal world of medieval politics, a place of harsh realities but predictable consequences. It was a system built on honor, however flexible, and personal bonds, however strained. It was this very system that Edward the Red would learn to exploit, not by breaking its rules, but by twisting them into a shape they were never meant to hold. The turning point, the moment the game began to change, arrived not with an invading army, but with a tragic accident at sea. In 1290, the 7-year-old heir to the Scottish throne, Margaret, the Maid of Norway, died during her voyage to claim her kingdom. Her death plunged Scotland into a succession crisis known as the Great Cause, with over a dozen claimants vying for the empty throne. The nation teetered on the brink of a devastating civil war, Into this power vacuum stepped Edward the Wee, not as a conqueror, but as a concerned neighbor, a strong hand offering stability. His move was a stroke of political genius. He would not impose a king, he would arbitrate the dispute. He invited the Scottish nobles to meet him at Norham Castle and presented himself as a neutral judge, the only figure with the authority and power to peacefully resolve the crisis. But this offer came with a non-negotiable prerequisite, a poison pill elegantly disguised as legal procedure. Before he would hear a single claim, every contender in the assembled Scottish nobility had to formally recognize him as Lord Paramount of Scotland. He was no longer just a neighboring king, he was now the ultimate legal authority over their entire realm. With this single act, the weapon of choice shifted from the sword to the legal writ. The language of power changed overnight. The old personal vocabulary of homage and fealty was replaced by the cold, impersonal grammar of the courtroom. Jurisdiction, claimant, overlordship, sovereignty. Edward's lawyers, armed with ancient texts and dubious historical precedents, argued that English kings had always held this right. The Scottish nobles, each desperate to win the crown for themselves and terrified of a rival taking it by force, were trapped by their own ambition. To get a chance at the throne, they had to concede the kingdom's independence. One by one, they acquiesced. The cage door had been opened, and they had walked in willingly. The loss of a nation's freedom wasn't marked by the clash of steel, but by the scratch of a quill on parchment. Once Edward had chosen John Balliol as the new King of Scots, a man he correctly assessed as the most pliable of the main contenders, he began to tighten his grip. The theoretical legal authority he had won was now put into brutal practice. Edward treated King John not as a fellow monarch, but as a subordinate vassal, a provincial manager to be disciplined at will. He deliberately humiliated Balliol, summoning him to English courts to answer for petty lawsuits filed by his own Scottish subjects. The message was clear: the King of Scots was no longer sovereign, even within his own borders. This relentless pressure inevitably led to rebellion. In 1296, the Scots under Balliol formed an alliance with France and renounced their allegiance to Edward. Edward's response was not disappointment. It was the opportunity he had been waiting for. He marched his army north and, in a calculated act of terror, unleashed them upon the prosperous Scottish port of Berwick-upon-Tweed. The massacre was horrifying and indiscriminate. Chronicles of the time claim thousands of men, women, and children were slaughtered over 2 days. The sack of Berwick was not a battle. It was a statement. This was the price of defiance. In the wake of this terror, Edward swept through Scotland, forcing the surrender of King John and demanding new, more comprehensive oaths of loyalty. The result was the Ragman Rolls, a collection of over 2,000 declarations of fealty, signed and sealed by virtually every significant landowner in Scotland. This was bureaucracy as a weapon of mass submission. The wax seal on a document became a shackle. The system no longer offered a choice. It was a machine for enforcing compliance, and its gears were greased with blood and fear. The political game was over. Now there was only a stark choice: collaborate with the English administration and survive as a servant in your own home, or resist and face not just political disfavor, but utter military and economic ruin. The final and most crucial evolution in this system was ideological. To justify the level of violence he was prepared to use, Edward needed to elevate the crime of his enemies. Resistance could no longer be a mere political act. It had to be a mortal sin. And so, the English legal and political machine redefined treason. Drawing on the medieval political theory of the king's two bodies, treason was framed not as an attack on the mortal man Edward, but as a sacrilegious assault on the immortal body politic, the divine and perpetual institution of the crown itself. The king was God's chosen representative on earth. Therefore, to defy the king was to defy God. Resistance was not just rebellion, it was heresy. William Wallace, a commoner who had dared to raise an army and lead a nation against an anointed king, was the ultimate embodiment of this sacrilege. In the eyes of Edward's system, he was not a patriot fighting for his country. He was a festering disease on the sacred body of the state. A disease cannot be reasoned with or imprisoned. It must be violently and publicly purged. This theological framework is the key to understanding the grotesque ritual of being hanged, drawn, and quartered. It was not random cruelty. It was a deeply symbolic performance. The victim was dragged to the gallows, for his crime was too base to allow him to walk. He was hanged, but cut down while alive to suffer the pains of death without its mercy. He was emasculated and disemboweled, his entrails burned before his eyes for begetting traitors and harboring traitorous thoughts in his heart and gut. He was then beheaded, severing the seat of his treasonous will. Finally, his body was quartered the 4 pieces to be scattered across the kingdom, a denial of a whole body for burial, and a terrifying symbol that he could never be made whole again, not even at the final resurrection. This was the logical endpoint of the system Edward had built over decades, a system where legal procedure legitimized political conquest, where administration enforced total compliance, and where theology justified annihilation. Justice had become a ritual of purification, and William Wallace was destined to be its most famous sacrifice. You didn't notice the machine being built because the blueprints were labeled law and order. The system was built. The theology was written. All it needed was a subject. The gears of Edward's perfectly engineered machine of justice were primed and waiting for a man whose defiance was so absolute, whose legend was so potent, that his destruction could serve as the ultimate lesson. And in William Wallace Edward Tharp, I found the perfect candidate. This is not the story of a flawless hero from a storybook. It is the story of a flawed, furious man whose triumphs and tragedies would provide the raw material for the most spectacular state-sponsored performance of the Middle Ages. Our narrative begins not with a grand army, but with an act of street-level vengeance that caught fire and spread across a nation. In 1297, William Wallace, then a minor figure of the gentry and outlaw with a grievance, allegedly murdered the English sheriff of Lanark, William Heselrigg. The reasons are lost to legend, perhaps in revenge for the death of his wife, but the act itself was an unmistakable signal. It was not a strategic move planned in a war council. It was a visceral cry of defiance, a spark in a landscape saturated with the fuel of resentment. That spark ignited a blaze. Joined by other disgruntled Scots, Wallace began a guerrilla campaign that culminated in the single most humiliating defeat ever inflicted upon an English army, the Battle of Stirling Bridge. The scene itself was a strategic nightmare waiting to happen. The English commanders, the Earl of Surrey and the deeply loathed Treasurer Hugh de Cressingham, were arrogant. They saw a rabble of Scottish spearmen and discounted them. They had heavy cavalry armored knights, the pinnacle of medieval military technology. The Scots had Wallace, and Wallace understood the terrain. He also understood the psychology of his enemy. He waited. He watched as the English army, impatient and overconfident, began to file across the dangerously narrow bridge, a bottleneck that negated their overwhelming numbers. When just enough of the English vanguard, including the plump Treasurer Cressingham, was trapped on the Scottish side, Wallace gave the order. The Scottish spearmen charged down from the high ground, seizing the bridgehead. The trap was sprung. The English knights, bogged down in the marshy ground, were slaughtered. Those still on the bridge, caught in a panicked crush, were pushed into the river to drown. It was a masterclass in tactics, a brutal and stunning victory. A force of commoners had annihilated the flower of English chivalry. Legend claims the Scots flayed Cressingham's corpse, and Wallace had a sword belt made from his skin. True or not, the message was clear: the rebellion was real, and it had a leader who was both brilliant and utterly ruthless. Overnight, William Wallace was transformed from a provincial outlaw into the guardian of Scotland, the de facto ruler of the nation. He was no longer just a rebel. He was a head of state, leading an army, dispensing justice, and even launching audacious raids deep into northern England. For a brief, glorious moment, it seemed the impossible had happened. A sensible person, a pragmatic politician, would have known this couldn't last. A sensible person would have used the victory at Stirling as a bargaining chip for a negotiated peace. Wallace was not a sensible person, or perhaps he simply had no other choice but to see the fight to its end. The following year, in 1298, Edward I, now personally leading his army, brought the full, terrifying weight of the English war machine to bear at the Battle of Falkirk. This time, there would be no narrow bridge, no tactical blunders. This was a battle on an open field, a contest of brute force where Edward held all the advantages. Wallace arranged his spearmen into 4 massive hedgehog-like formations called schiltrons. These rings of spears were theoretically impenetrable to heavy cavalry, and they were. The English knights charged, and they were broken against the Scottish spear points again and again. But Edward had a new weapon, one that would dominate the battlefields of Europe for the next century, the English longbow. He unleashed a storm of arrows upon the static Scottish formations. The schiltrons could not move, they could not retaliate. They could only stand and die as thousands of armor-piercing arrows rained down upon them, a relentless mechanical slaughter from a distance. The Scottish heavy cavalry, composed of nobles, whose loyalty to the commoner Wallace was perhaps questionable, fled the field, leaving the spearmen to their fate. Once the schiltrons were sufficiently weakened and broken, the English knights charged in to finish the bloody work. Wallace escaped with his life, but his army was destroyed. His aura of invincibility was shattered. He resigned the guardianship soon after his brief meteoric rise, crashing back to Earth. He was once again an outlaw, a fugitive. He spent the next several years in the wilderness, a ghost moving through the courts of Europe. He traveled to France, perhaps even to Rome, desperately trying to rally support for his lost cause, a diplomat haunted by the memory of his one great victory and his one catastrophic defeat. By 1305, the Scottish resistance had been all but crushed. Most nobles had once again submitted to Edward. Wallace was a lonely, hunted figure. The end came not on a battlefield, but in the quiet of a house near Glasgow. He was betrayed by a fellow Scot, Sir John de Menteith, a knight who had sworn allegiance to Edward. The exact details are murky, but the outcome was not. The great symbol of Scottish resistance was captured not by an English army, but by a countryman seeking favor and reward. It was a bitter, ignominious end to his campaign, a stark reminder that the deepest wounds were often inflicted not by the declared enemy, but by the divisions within. The capture of William Wallace was the moment Edward I had been awaiting for 8 long years. This was not to be a simple prisoner transfer. It was to be a meticulously managed victory tour, a moving spectacle designed to demonstrate the reach and inevitability of English power. Chained and heavily guarded, Wallace was marched south on a 20-day journey to London. The procession deliberately passed through major English towns and villages where he was put on public display. Crowds gathered to jeer, to spit, to throw filth at the legendary Scottish ogre, the monster from the north who had terrorized their borders. It was a systematic mobile degradation, stripping him of his humanity long before he ever reached a courtroom. His arrival in London was the climax of this parade. The entire city, it seemed, turned out to see him. He was no longer a man, but a symbol of defeated rebellion, a living trophy of the king's victory. Lodged in the Tower of London, he awaited the final performance, a trial, whose verdict was already written. The stage for this performance was Westminster Hall, the ancient heart of English monarchy and law. The grandeur was intentional. The cavernous, timber-roofed hall had witnessed the coronations of kings and the development of English common law. To try Wallace here was to wrap a political assassination in the sacred robes of ancient justice. The judges, led by the Chief Justice, Sir Peter Mallory, were assembled. An audience of nobles and city dignitaries was in place. This was not a legal proceeding. It was high theater. The charges were read, a litany of crimes designed to paint him as a demonic figure: treason against King Edward, murder of English subjects, arson and sacrilege for burning churches and their holy relics. When finally asked how he pleaded to the charge of treason, Wallace, after years of silence and humiliation, spoke. He admitted to being an enemy of the English king. He admitted to battle, to arson, to killing. But to the central charge, the one that truly mattered, he gave a defiant, history-altering response. In a clear voice that echoed through the great hall, he declared, "I cannot be a traitor to Edward, for I was never his subject. He is not my sovereign. He never received my oath, and while life is in this persecuted body, he never shall receive it." In that moment, he ceased to be a prisoner begging for his life. He was a statesman making a final legal and political argument on the world stage. He was not denying his actions. he was denying the entire premise of the trial. He argued that he was not a rebellious subject, but an enemy combatant, the leader of a sovereign nation captured in a time of war. He was claiming the legal status of a prisoner of war who should be ransomed, not executed as a common criminal. The court was stunned into silence, but only for a moment. Sir Peter Mallory immediately dismissed the argument. The system Edward had built had no room for such distinctions. By its definition, anyone who resisted the Lord Paramount was by default a traitor. The purpose of this trial was not to debate the nuances of international law. Its purpose was to pronounce a sentence that had been decided months, if not years, in advance. There would be no defense, no witnesses, no jury. There was only the charge and the inevitable horrifying sentence. The sentence pronounced by Sir Peter Mallory was a recitation of carefully choreographed horror, each element tied to a specific aspect of Wallace's alleged crimes. For the crime of treason, he was to be drawn on a hurdle through the streets of London to the place of execution. For the crimes of robbery, homicide, and felony, he was to be hanged. For the crime of sacrilege against God and the Holy Church, his entrails were to be drawn from his body and burned before him while he was still alive. And finally, for being an outlaw who could not be absolved, his head was to be severed from his body, and his body was to be divided into 4 parts. The sentence was not just a prescription for death, it was a detailed blueprint for the complete and utter annihilation of a human being. The final journey began. He was stripped, tied to a wooden hurdle, a frame designed to prevent the body from being torn apart too quickly, and dragged by 2 horses from Westminster through the entire length of London to Smithfield, a journey of several miles over rough, dung-strewn cobblestones. This was the Via Dolorosa of London, the final act of public shaming, ensuring that every citizen saw the traitor brought low. The scene at Smithfield was one of a carnival. A massive crowd had gathered. Food and ale were sold. It was a public holiday, the greatest show in town. In the center of the market stood the stage, a tall gallows, a butcher's block, and a fire already blazing. The ritual began. Wallace was hanged by the neck, but cut down before he could die of strangulation, conscious and gasping. He was then tied down, and the long, agonizing process of his evisceration began. The final moments were a testament to the terrifying creativity of medieval punishment designed to inflict the maximum possible physical and psychological suffering. When it was all over, the executioner, his work complete, raised the severed head to the silent crowd. The man was gone. The spectacle was finished. The crowd began to disperse, taking with them a memory of horror that would be told and retold for generations. But Edward's performance was not yet complete. The man was dead, but the body remained. And what he did next with the pieces of William Wallace would be his greatest strategic calculation and his most catastrophic mistake. The broadcast was about to begin. Welcome to the chamber. The performance at Smithfield is over. The crowd has gone home. The blood has been washed from the cobblestones. Now the real work begins. We move from the what to the why. We are no longer storytellers, we are coroners. And the body on the table is not just that of a man, but of an entire political strategy. To understand what truly happened to William Wallace, we must begin the autopsy. Our first task in any investigation is to examine the official story, the narrative presented by the authorities. Let us take it at face value. According to the English Crown and the court records of Westminster, William Wallace was a treasonous outlaw, a murderer, and a sacrilegious terrorist. He was afforded a legal trial under the laws of England and received the prescribed and just punishment for his heinous crimes. It sounds clean, it sounds legal, it sounds final. And it is the first and most important lie. To expose it, we need only look at the treason charge itself. The entire legal foundation for Wallace's execution rested on this single charge. Yet, as Wallace himself stated in Westminster Hall, the charge was legally baseless. In the intricate world of medieval oaths, treason was the ultimate crime a subject could commit against his sovereign. It was a violation of a sacred personal bond. But William Wallace had never sworn that oath. He had never performed homage to Edward I. He was not a rebellious subject who had broken his word. He was an enemy combatant, the leader of a foreign army captured in a time of war. Under the codes of chivalry that governed this era, his status was that of a prisoner of war. He should have been held for ransom as captured knights and nobles routinely were. But Edward's system had no use for chivalry when politics demanded something more. The trial was not an application of the law, it was a perversion of it. Its purpose was to perform a legal alchemy, to transmute a prisoner of war into a common criminal, to strip him of his status, his rights, and his very identity, all so he could be subjected to a punishment that was illegal to inflict upon an enemy soldier. The state's first act of violence against Wallace wasn't at the gallows, but in the courtroom, where they murdered his legal identity. With his identity erased, his body was no longer his own. It became the property of the state, a resource to be utilized. This brings us to the centerpiece of this entire investigation, the map of the body. After the execution, Wallace's body was not buried. It was processed and distributed. This was not a random act of desecration. It was the most calculated and precisely targeted propaganda campaign of the 14th century. Let's follow the delivery route. First, his head. It was dipped in tar to preserve it and placed on a spike atop London Bridge. This was the most prominent public space in the capital, a gateway for international trade and travel. The message was, for everyone, this is the fate of those who challenge the English crown. A public service announcement written in bone and gristle. Next, the 4 quarters of his body. They were sent north. His right arm went to Newcastle upon Tyne, the main military fortress and staging ground for English invasions of Scotland. The message was aimed at the army. This is what happens to the arm that dares to raise a sword against us. His left arm was sent to Berwick upon Tweed, the fiercely contested border town that Edward had brutally sacked years earlier. It was a grim warning posted on the very doorstep of Scotland. His right leg was displayed in Perth, a major political and administrative center for the Scots, a place where their own kings held court. The message was one of political castration. Your ambitions of statehood will be crippled. And finally, in an act of supreme psychological cruelty, his left leg was sent to Stirling, the scene of his greatest, most impossible victory, the place where he had humiliated the English army and become a legend. Edward was deliberately desecrating a sacred memory. He was attempting to overwrite a story of triumph with an image of butchery, to poison a national myth at its very source. This was not a burial. This was a broadcast. Edward was using the pieces of a man's body to draw a border, to create a fence of terror across the consciousness of a nation. He was performing a cartographic exorcism, attempting to cleanse the map of Wallace's defiant spirit. But a broadcast is only successful if the audience receives the message as intended, and they did not. While Edward controlled the transmission, he could not control the reception. Where the English authorities displayed the rotting parts of a traitor, the Scottish people saw the holy relics of a martyr. The oral traditions of the time, the songs of bards sung in secret, and the later chronicles like Blind Harry's epic poem, The Wallace, show us how the message was hijacked. The head on a spike in a distant city did not inspire fear. It inspired a burning, furious sense of injustice. The limbs sent north did not serve as warnings. They became pilgrimage sites. They were seeds of rebellion planted in the very soil Edward sought to pacify. Edward's perfectly crafted message of terror had been received as a call to arms. So we arrive at the final diagnosis. The curse at the heart of this story was never supernatural. It was a uniquely and tragically human one. The cursed chamber was not the dungeon in the tower or the gallows at Smithfield. It was the mind of a king, so brilliant, so powerful, that he could no longer imagine being wrong. The curse was the arrogance of power amplified by the system of performative justice. Edward the Fart, a master of law administration and warfare, was so convinced of his ability to engineer reality, to control the narrative through overwhelming spectacle, that he fundamentally misunderstood his audience. He believed a performance of absolute horror would produce absolute fear. He failed to comprehend that for a people who felt they had nothing left to lose, a performance of martyrdom produces a hero. He built a perfect machine of terror, utterly blind to the fact that it was also a perfect machine for creating a legend that would outlive his empire. We step now from the cold analytical space of the chamber and back into the flow of time to render a final verdict. The case file is closed. The evidence has been examined. The conclusion is inescapable. The meticulously planned execution of William Wallace, a campaign designed by one of the most formidable kings in European history, was a catastrophic, self-inflicted wound. Edward I, the master strategist, the hammer of the Scots, had waged a perfect campaign of terror. And he lost. He lost because he won the war against one man's body, but in doing so declared a war on memory, itself a war he could never win. He thought he was extinguishing a spark, but instead he poured fuel on a fire that would burn for centuries. By making an example of William Wallace, he made him eternal. He killed the man, but he created an immortal idea of defiance. Edward believed he was closing a bloody chapter of Scottish rebellion. He had no way of knowing he was actually writing the first page of Scotland's national epic. The echoes of that day in Smithfield did not fade. They amplified, becoming the rallying cry for a renewed war. The immediate ripple effect was the transformation of Robert the Bruce. While Wallace was a man of passion and fury, Bruce was a calculating nobleman who had played the political game on both sides. But the public butchery of Wallace showed Bruce and the rest of the Scottish nobility that there was no middle ground. There could be no negotiated peace, no lasting compromise with a king who dealt in such absolutes. Wallace's martyrdom had made the choice stark submission or sovereignty. A few months later, Bruce murdered his rival John Comyn and seized the Scottish throne, reigniting the war with a new and desperate ferocity. 9 years later, at the Battle of Bannockburn, the ghost of Wallace was arguably the most potent weapon on the field. As Scottish schiltrons held firm against charges of English knights, they were not just fighting for their new king, they were fighting for the memory of their first champion. The battle was not just for land, but for Wallace's legacy. His name became a prayer on the lips of soldiers and a curse upon their enemies. The stunning victory they won that day, securing Scotland's de facto independence, was built on a foundation of his sacrifice. That victory was soon codified in ink. In 1320, the Scottish nobles sent a letter to the Pope, a document that would become known as the Declaration of Arbroath. It is one of the most powerful assertions of national identity ever written, and its defiant spirit is pure Wallace. It declares, "For as long as but 100 of us remain alive, never will we on any conditions be brought under English rule. It is in truth not for glory, nor riches, nor honors that we are fighting, but for freedom, for that alone which no honest man gives up, but with life itself." The man who had been dismembered for treason had become the very definition of a nation's soul. He was no longer a historical figure. He was a founding myth, a story told to children, a song sung by rebels, the eternal symbol of resistance against impossible odds. And so, we are left with the quiet, chilling wisdom that so often surfaces in these chambers. History is a logbook of plausible mistakes made with perfect confidence. Edward's plan to terrorize Scotland into submission was not irrational. It was a logical, well-resourced, and brutally efficient strategy based on a single, fundamentally flawed premise that breaking a man's body could break a people's spirit. It is a mistake that the powerful have made again and again throughout the centuries. So what is your verdict? Was Edward the Warren a bloodthirsty tyrant who simply miscalculated? Or was he a brilliant strategist whose perfectly logical plan was derailed by the irrational power of martyrdom? Was his failure a flaw in the man, or a flaw in the very nature of power itself? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to Cursed Chambers to unlock the secrets of more histories they never meant for you to read.